But you're beginning to now talk, I sense, something in regards that is described within your book, Cosmopolitan Ground.
Absolutely, yeah.
And this idea of the cosmopolitan is something which is intriguing because it sounds to begin with as though it's an urban condition, but you seem to be able to structure it much more as a kind of lifestyle condition, more to anything else.
Yeah, I think it's a spatial condition, which, I mean, we discovered it through our engagement with landscape, but of course that engagement with landscape instantly becomes a problem when you say, well, what's then your response to an urban condition? And the way that we worked through that was to discover that what we're interested in actually is the way that places are structured and constructed and the way that they're politically inscribed, but that inscription responds also to the very particular physical conditions. So it's that play between those two aspects of sites, really, that we end up working with. So we found the transition from landscapes into urban settings quite straightforward because we realised that what we learnt by engaging in landscape was that places are politically inscribed and are spatially particular. Mm-hmm. And they're the two things that we really try and work with.
And do you find that this position translates when you move outside of Tasmania and allows you to then read particular places, like, for example, in the Prague Library competition, that philosophy or agenda, when applied to a city on the other side of the world, which is significantly older than anything in Hobart, how does that give you a device to work through another set of ideas?
Yeah, well, I think that is an important story actually in terms of how we learnt to practice what we do, that particular project, the Prague Library competition. It was an interesting one in that it throws up some of the dilemmas or qualities, if you like, of designing. I mean, theoretically, we're sitting in Hobart and Sydney thinking about a library in Prague, which is in some ways completely out of our experience. However, on the other hand, one of the most intense theatre experiences I can remember as a child, going to the Theatre Royal in the school bus, was to see a performance by the Black Theatre of Prague. And I remember the scenes, to this day. It was, and that's, not quite 40 years ago, but almost. So for me, Prague has always had some kind of presence in terms of, and it was a very spatial play. And then, of course, reading all the great literature that's come out of Prague, going backpacking through Europe and sitting on the benches on the side of the Vltava River reading The Unbearable Lightness of Being and all those kinds of experiences are things that we did. Also, arriving in Prague, going to see Adolf Loos's Villa Mula, imagining that what I would see is evidence of how bad modernism was, and discovering, the most wonderful kind of spatial crucible that you could imagine, and discovering a whole new side of what was going on actually in that architecture of that time that had been completely reduced and written out of histories of modernism by people like Hitchcock and Johnson. So in fact, there had been, that doesn't replace an experience that is as dense and rich as actually living in a place, but it gives you some hooks and handles into that condition. The other really great spatial experience there was discovering Plešnik, who until quite recently I thought was a Czech architect, but I've discovered actually is a Slovenian architect. But again, this was one of those wonderful discoveries, going to Prague Castle as a kind of backpacker, not really knowing what to expect, and discovering this little moment, his bull stair, and being in that central enclosed space in the middle of the castle on top of the promontory that sticks back out into the valley. And inside that space, seeing what is just slightly larger than a domestically scaled door with a stair sort of descending through it, and coming out the other side of Prague, of the wall of Prague Castle, and being presented with the city. And it was it's a bizarre spatial experience, and one that has intrigued me ever since. And recently I've begun to think that the magic of the moment is that in fact what happens is you come from the outside into the inside of Prague Castle and into the sort of piazza that is the middle space, and you go in through a doorway that goes down and out through the wall, and what happens is that the Prague is then represented to you as some kind of interior. So what you experience as an exterior is transformed to an interior through that spatial moment, and I think that was a really wonderful thing. And of course a lot of the work that we do is about that idea of the architectural surface, as in the realisation of the relationship between the inside and the outside, which to me is what the surface is all about. There's been a lot written about the surface in architecture, most of which I find completely uninteresting, because really that's what the surface is about. It is about that moment that...
So how do you stitch together then this experience of landscape, this childhood memory, and then a kind of educated spatial understanding of a particular moment? How do they become triggers for a competition about a library?
Well, I mean, practically the way that we work is to begin collecting this stuff and to say, let's not worry too much about the building as such at this point in time. Let's just collect stuff about the project. And when we would talk about a project, we would talk about it in multiple ways. You know,